just look at part of a picture, you don't see the whole picture, right? And you cannot, if you don't see the whole picture, you cannot see the patterns, the configurations of the picture. So looking at societies cross-culturally, historically, through, using this larger database, it was possible to see configurations, patterns that are not visible, looked at through the lenses of conventional social categories. And, well, there were no names for them, so I called one the domination system and the other one the partnership system. Now, all the books that I have written over the last 30 years have drawn from this research. And the first was The Chalice and the Blade, as you heard. I was really very pleased. The last is now, as you heard, is in 25 foreign editions, and I was very pleased that the last edition was in Urdu for use in Pakistan, which again shows you that the issue isn't East versus West. There are people in the East who are trying to move also to the partnership side. And that book was the first book that introduced this, partnership and domination systems to a general readership. And it also introduced my cultural transformation theory, which proposes that evidence from archaeology and myth indicates that the earliest cradles of civilization oriented more to the partnership side, not ideal, but they did orient more to the partnership side until during a period of great disequilibrium. And yes, we're again in a period of great disequilibrium, aren't we? And this is important for us to keep in mind, as we know from chaos theory and nonlinear dynamic. That's when you can get fundamental change. But during this period of great disequilibrium, there was a shift to the domination side. And by the way, when The Chalice and the Blade was published in China by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, they published all my books in China, in Chinese, a group of scholars at the Academy got together and they tested cultural transformation theory in Asia. And they found that, yeah, there was also this shift from more of a partnership to a domination direction. And they wrote their own book, The Chalice and the Blade in Chinese Culture, which came out in 1995 in both English and Chinese. Now, if you look at history from the perspective of these two underlying social categories, you begin to see connections. Connections that otherwise, in matters that otherwise just seem random and disconnected. For instance, if you look at modern history through this new lens of the partnership-domination continuum, you see that over the last centuries, we have been moving, during the Industrial Revolution, that was part of it, this equilibrium, right? We have been moving more to the partnership side, albeit, against fierce resistance and periodic regressions. And if you really think about it, and this was really fascinating because doing this research was a series, as so many of my readers say, aha experiences. If you look at all the modern progressive movements, you see that while they're different, they all have a commonality. They all were challenges to entrenched traditions of domination. Think about it. The Enlightenment so-called rights of man movement, what did it challenge? The so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule over their, quote, subjects, right? The feminist movement challenged another so-called divinely ordained tradition of men ruling over the women and children in the, quote, castles, a military image of their homes. If you look at the abolitionists, the civil rights, the anti-colonial movements challenged another so-called divinely ordained right of one race to rule over a so-called inferior race, right? If you look at the movement for economic justice, what did it challenge? Top-down economic control. And that's a long struggle, and we're still dealing with it a great deal, aren't we? If you look at the movements against violence, whether it's the peace movement or more recently, the movement to really end traditions of violence against women and children, you know, in our intimate relations, because there's a global pandemic, as we're beginning to more and more see publicized. What do they challenge? They challenge something basic to domination systems, the use of force to impose your will on others, the use of force to maintain these rigid rankings of domination, be it man over man, man over woman, race over race, religion over religion, ethnicity, you know, you name it. And if you look at the environmental movement, it also challenges a tradition of domination, doesn't it? The once hallowed conquest of nature, right? Which at our level of technological development, because that's what the problem is, really could take us to an evolutionary dead end. So looking at history through these lenses, you see that the movement of which you are a part, the movement to bring higher status, better pay, and more recognition to nursing profession, and with this to the work of caring, that's an integral part, isn't it, of this partnership movement. And of course, the good news is that the cultural transformation from domination to partnership systems is already in progress. In fact, if it weren't, we wouldn't be here. We'd be killed, basically, for just talking about these things or even thinking about them, right? But this movement has been much too slow, and it's been very uneven. For example, in some world regions, like in Saudi Arabia, some of you know, nurses are thought of as maids, as so inferior that in a survey, the majority of men, over 60%, said they wouldn't even think of marrying a nurse because, you know, that's just so devalued in the culture. And yes, I did look at, in preparing for this talk, at some of the studies about your profession, about healthcare and about nursing, and found some fascinating things like what I just shared with you. So where are we here? Even in the United States, okay, we still have a very long way to go. And I'd like to suggest to you that a major obstacle has been that we have not paid attention to connections in this movement towards partnership. And very specifically, connections between how we can, which are essential to understand if we are to build environments that, that will sustain joy, that show the connections between politics and economics on the one hand, and between really the foundational human relations, which, as you know, are, well, the relations between the female and male halves of humanity, and between them and their daughters and sons, which, as we also know from neuroscience, they create our earliest experiences, don't you? Our earliest observations and experiences, and affect, as we now know from neuroscience, nothing less than how our brains develop. So that takes me to the second book that I wrote, drawing from this research, a book that has a rather heretic title called Sacred Pleasure, because we know how many of the images we've inherited from earlier, more domination-oriented times sacralize either the suffering or the infliction of pain, right? Rather than the joy of sharing and of pleasure. It's interesting. And if you look at prehistory, you see a very different set of images. But we don't have time to go into that because I have a lot to tell you about. So, but basically, that book looks at how spirituality and sexuality, as well as parenting, romantic love, and just about everything else are very different in the context of a partnership or domination system. And it clarifies something very important that's directly relevant to the theme of this conference of sustaining joy, that basically domination systems are held together by fear of pain, right? Or pain. Because that's the only way really that you ultimately maintain these rankings, these rigid rankings. Whereas partnership systems can rely much more on mutuality and the sharing of pleasures. And of course, look, I mean, there's going to be pain. You know, we get sick, we die, there are earthquakes, there are floods. But the difference is that in partnership systems, this infliction of pain and fear and so on doesn't have to be built into the system. And that is a huge, huge difference. So if we really want to sustain joy, as I said, we certainly want to work on ourselves, but we also want to use our power and our influence to work on our environments. And I'll get to that in just a minute as we compare the partnership and domination configuration. But first, I quickly want to clarify some very important matters. By partnership system, I do not mean a completely flat organization. You know, they just don't work, do they? I mean, Kurt Lewin, the father of social psychology, found that out way back, as some of you know. They lead actually to domination systems because we need some structure. And yes, we need hierarchies. We need parents, right? We need teachers. We need managers. We need leaders. But, and this is really very important, in the course of my research, I coined the term hierarchy of domination and hierarchy of actualization. And this is a distinction that we're actually beginning to read about, perhaps not using this language, in the management literature, aren't we? About how the good manager shouldn't just be the cop, the controller, right? The dominator, but somebody who inspires, who empowers others to be the best they can be. You know, sometimes somebody has to make a decision. There has to be a locus of responsibility, right? But in a hierarchy of domination, sustainability, it's completely different. I mean, it really sustains pain. Because what? What happens there? Accountability, respect, benefit, they just flow from the bottom up, right? Whereas in a hierarchy of actualization, it can flow both ways. And that makes a huge difference. I also want to emphasize something else that may come as a shock to some, because we hear so much about, oh, if we only collaborate, if we only cooperate, all will be well. Well, the difference between partnership and domination systems isn't that. Because look, people collaborate all the time in domination systems. Monopolies collaborate, terrorists collaborate, hey, criminal gangs collaborate. So yeah, that is not the difference. What we're talking about is, as I said, two very different configurations, and I'm going to get to that right now. Let's start with the core configuration of the domination system, which, as I said, transcends the conventional social categories. And I want to quickly give you, well, I want to illustrate it with two cultures. One is Western, the other is Eastern. One is secular, the other is religious. One is technologically developed, and the other isn't. These two cultures are the Nazis and the Taliban. Now, certainly there are differences, right, between them, and big differences. But if you really look through this lens of the partnership or domination configuration, you see that they all share the same core configuration, as do other repressive and violent regimes. In the first place, both are extremely authoritarian in both the family and the tribe or state. The family, okay? I mean, we're talking about something that's so ignored in studies of society. Secondly, both are extremely warlike and violent. And third, both rigidly rank the male half of humanity over the female half. So much so that for both the Nazis and the Taliban, getting women back to their, quote, traditional place, right, in a, quote, traditional family, is a top priority. And of course, we know that those terms are code words, aren't they? For a rigidly authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, highly punitive family, where children learn very early on that it's very painful to even think of questioning orders, no matter how unjust. And that is basic, isn't it, to domination systems. So none of this is coincidental, nor is it coincidental that these kinds of cultures, they think of, quote, masculinity as male identity, as just equating it always with violence, with control, with honor, right? Honor is to dominate, to control, even to kill for honor is supposed to be just great. I mean, that's manly, that's the right thing to do. And really, that they also, at the same time, for them, women and anything stereotypically considered soft or feminine, such as caring and nonviolence, is devalued and viewed as weak and inferior. So you're beginning to get some of the system's dynamics, aren't you, that aren't visible through conventional lenses. And I really want to emphasize that we're not talking about anything inherent in women or men here, okay? Because we see that with all the fathers who are today doing fathering in, well, the way that used to be just mothering, right? Diapering babies, feeding babies. And on the other hand, we see how women are entering once rigidly closed male preserves, including leadership. So what we're talking about are stereotypes. And all this takes us to a matter that many people find uncomfortable to talk about or even think about, gender. And we might as well put that on the table, right? But we also should remember what the great sociologist Lewis Worth said. He said that the most important things in a society are those that people don't want to talk about. And we saw that with race, didn't we? And we started to talk about it, and we started to slowly, not enough, but to move forward. And the same is now true of gender. We are talking more about it, and we need to talk much more about it. Because what we're really talking about is not, as we're sometimes told, just a women's issue. I mean, just the fact that we consider that what affects half of humanity, actually the majority, is just a women's issue shows you how devalued, right? Women and so-called women's issues have been. We need to talk about it because it is through dominator norms for gender that children learn some very, very important life lessons that are really, really essential to understand. First, they learn to equate difference, beginning with the most fundamental difference in our species between female and male, with either superiority or inferiority, with either dominating or being dominated, with either being served or serving. And then, of course, they have a template because they learn that in childhood, in their families. They have a template that they learn it before their brains are fully developed, right? Because we know that our brains don't fully develop until we're in our 20s now. So what happens? They have this template, and they can then apply it to any difference, can't they? Whether it's racial, or whether it's ethnic, or whether it's sexual orientation, you name it. But they also learn something else, and that's another key life lesson, which is that not only women, but anything stereotypically associated women, including care work, is not as important as anything associated stereotypically with men or so-called hard masculine values. And this, of course, is directly affected, isn't it, in the nursing profession, because the profession has been and still is primarily composed of women, even though as the status of women rises, more men enter it, right? Which is a very, very interesting dynamic that we have to look at. So it is really only as the status of women has risen that the status of caring professions, such as nursing, has also risen, but it's very uneven. I mean, consider that according to the US Department of Labor, childcare workers, the people to whom we entrust our children, they receive an average of only $10 an hour with no benefits. And I always make the point, that we pay plumbers, right? the people to whom we entrust our pipes, $50 to $100 an hour. But, you know, look at what we pay the childcare worker. And of course, we insist that the plumbers be trained, right? Because how could we entrust our pipes to people who aren't? But we don't insist that all childcare workers be trained. And of course, that's not logical. It's really pretty pathological. And, you know, all right. But that really takes me to what I promised we'd pay special attention to, which is economics. And yeah, most people really don't think that gender has anything to do with economics. I mean, do you? No, I mean, you haven't. But think about it for a moment. Have you ever wondered, for instance, why so many politicians always find money for weapons, for prisons, for wars, you know, for that hard, stereotypically masculine stuff? But somehow they can't find money, you know, for caring for people, for health care, for child care, for that soft, stereotypically feminine stuff. And yeah, underlying this is, because it's an irrational set of priorities, obviously, that certainly doesn't, you know, lead to sustained joy. It leads to a lot of pain, actually. Well, underlying this is a gendered system of values that we really have to become aware of and make visible. And it's a system we've inherited. I mean, I really want to make that point. From earlier times that oriented more to the domination side. I mean, think about it, just a few hundred years ago in the European Middle Ages, which, by the way, looked a lot like the Taliban. You know, the Inquisition, right? The Crusades, you know, the Holy Wars, the witch burnings, you know, whether you publicly slowly stone a woman to death or publicly slowly burn her to death, it's the same. It's exemplary public violence to terrorize a socially subordinated group into submission, isn't it? So women had, you know, very low status, were barred from just about everything. Children had no rights either. Well, you know, so devalued were women that theologians seriously debated whether women have an immortal soul like men. Yeah, I mean, that was serious, you know. Well, we have moved forward. In fact, I sometimes say when I get depressed that we haven't moved fast enough, I think of the European Middle Ages. Because clearly, this didn't happen by itself, my friends. It happened because women and men like you and I did something, right? So we can complete this shift, not to a perfect society, but to a much more sensible, right? And more humane society where we can seriously talk for not just a few, but for all of us about sustaining the joy that we have been given to feel by evolution, for all of these wonderful qualities that we have, for qualities that are really inhibited in domination systems, caring, creativity, empathy. You know, how can you feel empathy, really, if you have to be in that rigid dominator-dominated situation? So I want to quickly just tell you a little bit about economics from this different perspective, because it's really very, very important, and we have quite a bit of time together. So first of all, I'm going to suggest to you that if we're going to move forward economically, we really have to get past that old tired debate about capitalism versus socialism and socialism versus capitalism. Why? Because both really fail to take into account the economic value of the life-sustaining activities of our life support systems, really. I mean, so for both Adam Smith and Karl Marx, and they both meant well, you know, they wanted something better. I mean, and Marx was rebelling, of course, against what was supposed to have been accomplished by Smith, you know, who wanted a better system, who didn't, by the way, say there should be no government. He never said that. I mean, you got to really understand how things are read in a very selective way, aren't they? But for them, for both of them, it was really interesting if you analyze it. nature for both of them was there to be exploited. That was it. As for the life-sustaining work in households, the so-called women's work, right, of caring for children, for people's health, keeping a clean and healthy home environment, for them that was just reproductive work and not the productive work that they were interested in. And of course, they were only interested in markets. You know, Smith to extol them, Marx to excoriate them. But there is much more to economics than markets, much more. And therefore, really, to move forward and avoid all of these social, environmental, and yes, economic problems stemming from the old economic paradigm, because remember the subtitle of my talk does deal with changing paradigms. We really have to have a different view of what economics is about, what I call a full spectrum economic map that doesn't just include, as conventional economic theories do, the market economy, the government economy, to some extent the illegal economy, but the three life-sustaining sectors: the natural economy, the volunteer community economy, and the household economy. Now, that doesn't mean that we want to discard everything from capitalist and socialist theory. We want to retain the partnership elements, but once we have this full spectrum economic map, as I detail in my book, The Real Wealth of Nations, we have the basis for a new way of thinking about economics, and yes, a new way of structuring economics that recognizes something that once articulated, of course, sounds perfectly self-evident, that the real wealth of a nation, of our world, isn't financial. You certainly saw that, didn't you, with the melting into thin air of all of those credit swaps, all of those derivatives, right? That the real wealth consists of the contributions of people and of nature. So we need what we have not had, which are economic measurements, policies, and practices that give visibility and adequate value to the most important human work, the work of caring for people, starting in early childhood, and caring for nature. Now, people do a double take. I bet some of you did, just hearing caring and economics in the same sentence, right? But tell me, isn't that a terrible comment on how conditioned, how really brainwashed we've been to accept that uncaring values should drive economic systems? And we can and must change that. Now, there are going to be obstacles. One is, of course, people are going to tell you, yeah, it sounds nice, but you know, caring policies, they're just not economically efficient, right? You've heard that. Well, in reality, and there are tons of these studies in The Real Wealth of Nations, caring policies can actually be more economically efficient. I'll give you just one example from business. Companies that regularly appear in the best companies to work for, in the Working Mothers or the Fortune 500, they have a higher return to investors. Now, it makes sense, doesn't it? When people have flex time, when they have support, you know, family leave, paid parental leave, care, right? They work hard because they want those companies to do well so that they and their families have those benefits. And I should add that the partnership structure, not just the culture, but the structure, and I include structure under culture in the broader definition of culture, of an organization is very important and relates also directly to whether or not we can sustain joy, because look, people are less stressed and happier when they have a voice, right? That's a partnership structure. They perform better, don't they? They feel valued. They feel empowered to contribute and participate. In a partnership structure, conflict can be used creatively, right? Rather than suppressed or exacerbated, you know, by these power struggles. It can be used creatively to explore alternatives and challenge the status quo. Creativity is nurtured. I mean, think about it. There is more safety for risk-taking, isn't there? And I don't mean that reckless risk-taking, you know, that got us into this mess, which really shouldn't be rewarded. It should be penalized, considering all the damage that it does. But really, in the positive sense of less fear of making mistakes and permission to be inquisitive and to explore. Of course, communication, as I said, and benefits and accountability flow in all directions. And the workplace certainly is family friendly. You know, this balancing of life and work, you can't do it. I don't care how many time management courses you take. I mean, as you see, you know, I mean, you have to really change the context. And that's where you really come in, don't you? Because use your power, use your influence, as we've been talking about. Use your positive, you know, in partnership systems, in domination systems, you know, the title of the chalice and the blade, the chalice symbolizes dominator power, doesn't it? You know, power over, the power to dominate, the power to take life. In partnership system, the chalice symbolizes power. It's power to, power with, it's power to give life, to nurture life, to illuminate life. So there's nothing wrong with power. It's very different, again, in these two contexts, isn't it? All right, so you really have more of a synergistic sense of community in a partnership structure. And yes, that synergistic belonging can then extend to the planet. So you can create social and environmental consciousness, you know, the consciousness that's needed for long-range planning, which we have so little of today. And it's so suicidal, really, in every, not only in human terms, but in economic terms, so that we can have sustainability and, as you will see in just a moment, economic success. Because, and this takes me to another very important example, we're today told that we cannot afford to invest in our people, right? I mean, that's the whole thing, you know, the deficit. Well, I'd like to suggest to you that that's really a question not of money, but of priorities. It is very much a question of what our priorities are. And if you look at nations that have been very, very successful, I mean, let me just tell you about nations that at the beginning of the 20th century were so poor that there were famines. Sweden, Norway, Finland, you know, whole states. This state was populated by people fleeing, right, from these famines. Today, these nations are invariably in the highest ranks, not only of the United Nations Human Development Reports, but of the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Reports. And a major reason is that they invested in caring for their people. That's right. I mean, you know, they have government-supported childcare. I mean, we can't afford. In Montreal, I just recently spoke at the Academy of Management conference there. For $7 a day, you get high-quality childcare that you have professionally trained with master's degrees, professionals. But yeah, they're unionized, they're professional. Well, you couldn't afford it, but of course the government supports it, doesn't it? Why? Because it's an investment in their human capital, isn't it? And that's what we have to start thinking about. Okay, so they have universal health care, stipends to help families care for children, elder care with dignity, generous paid parental leave for both mothers and fathers. In fact, in a family where there's a mother and a father, if the father doesn't take it, nobody gets it. So it's a way of getting men to get that those neurochemical rewards of pleasure, right? Those endorphins for caring for their children. So it works for everybody. And of course, they have very high lifespans. They have low poverty rates, low criminal rates, and a high standard of living. And you know, people sometimes say, yeah, but they're so homogeneous. Well, first of all, there are a lot of small homogeneous nations that do not have those caring policies, that do not have a partnership structure, okay, and culture. And in any case, something that we really have to keep in mind, these people very often, they call themselves not socialist because they have a very active market economy as well as central planning. They call themselves caring societies, and that caring extends to the fact that proportionately they give more foreign aid through NGOs into the developing world than other developed nations. So it isn't just like we're going to help our in-group, okay? It's a more caring culture. But as I really want to get to is the partnership configuration, because none of this happened in a vacuum, right? It happened because these nations are in the forefront of moving to the partnership side of the continuum. Not ideal by any means. I mean, my friends in Finland and in Norway, they always complain. But you know how that is. I remember when I went to the UN conference in Nairobi, the women who were being, in their veils and stuff, you know, from Iran, who were being shepherded by these guys, you know, these very stern men. They said everything is great for women in Iran. But the women in Norway and Finland were complaining like crazy. All right, so you get it. I mean, when we have more of a voice, when we see that we can move forward, right? Hey, we want more. But anyway, they've moved more to the configuration of the partnership system. For one thing, they have more democracy in both the family and the state. Both the family and the state. Remember, we're looking at both now. They've been interestingly, and not coincidentally, they've been in the forefront of trying to leave behind traditions of domination and violence. The first peace studies came out of the Nordic nations. The first law saying that it's against the law to use physical discipline against children in families came out, and that's a global trend now. I mean, we're beginning to understand, you know, that if kids learn, right, if they experience or observe that violence is being used by one person to impose a will over another person, that it's okay. I mean, it's even moral, right, to use violence to impose your will on others. So that's very basic. They have a strong men's movement to disentangle, quote, masculinity from its dominator association with domination and violence, which takes me to the third part of the configuration, and you guessed it. They also have a much more equal partnership between the female and male halves of humanity. So much so that women are between 40 and 50% of the national legislatures. So there we can really talk about representative democracy, not like we have it here, where we just don't have it, do we? And we've got to change the conversation there. But now this is, again, where you have to understand the system's dynamics, because remember what I said, what happens when the status of women rises, right? As the status of women rises, a lot of things happen. Men no longer feel it is such a threat to their status, to their, quote, masculinity, to also embrace and back more caring policies, right? So you see how it all works. Now, I want to say this. This is not only important for you in the healthcare professions. And yeah, most of the nursing profession is still composed of women, and women worldwide still have the primary responsibility, don't we, for the caring work in families. So if we're really to sustain that joy and not be so stressed, because workers in these Nordic nations report lower levels of stress. You know, they pay more taxes, but look at what they get. I mean, look at what we pay for. You know, it's just to consider these things not in such simplistic ways. But it's really essential for women worldwide, because the fact that the work of care, and especially the work of care in families, in households, is not given value, is one of the major factors behind what we today know, that statistically, the mass of the world's poor and the poorest of the poor worldwide now are women and children. Even in the wealthy United States, women over the age of 65, according to the US Census Bureau, are significantly, almost twice, as a matter of fact, as likely to be poor as men of the same age. And it isn't only the workplace discrimination that we're finally beginning to hear more about. It's because most of these women are or were either full or part-time caregivers, and poverty is their reward. So, and I want to say, of course, I mean, we're talking about ignoring the obvious, because studies show, and we did such a study at the Center for Partnership Studies, a study called Women, Men, and the Global Quality of Life, that as the status of women rises, so does the general quality of life. We did this study analyzing data, statistical, because people always wanted quantified, so we quantified from 89 nations, comparing measures of quality of life, you know, all the way from infant mortality, human rights ratings, environmental ratings, etc., with measures of the status of women. And we found that the status of women can be a better predictor in significant respects of quality of life than GDP. Other studies, like the gender gap reports of the World Economic Forum, hey, they show that the nations with the lowest gender gaps are very economically successful. So we're talking about systems dynamics, and I really want to say that I want to end with some actions, because there's much more that I could share with you, but you can read my books and you'll find out much more. But if you really think about it, so much of what you are talking about here, the joy that comes from care, from creativity, from empowerment, right, of yourself and of others, you have to build the environments that sustain that, don't you, rather than inhibit it. And one of the most important factors, as I said, is economics. So I want to tell you about three action tools in closing, okay, that I invite you to join in. One of them is, well, my book, The Power of Partnership, because that book, and I've heard this from so many people who have read it, and it's a very good entry point. It's really a template for day-to-day individual actions. It's been a very useful tool that has helped many people to use the theme of this conference to find ways to bring sustainable joy into their lives. It is basically a template for people to start to live the partnership paradigm. But it's kind of a self-help book, but it goes way beyond other self-help books, because yes, it talks about how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to others in our intimate and work relations, but it also shows the relationship, what I've been talking with you about, to other relations, to how we relate to nature, to how our national and international relations, our spiritual relations, because they're all of one class, aren't they? And we have to consider the environment. For example, chapter 3 is called Widening the Circle of Caring. And like all the other chapters, it spells out concrete steps, first steps, second steps, going further. So that's one tool. A second tool is a tool that you can get at our website, partnershipway.org, and it's our Caring and Connected Parenting Guide. And it is based on the latest neuroscience. It's been endorsed by Brazelton